This week, NATO bombers blasted off to simulate nuclear strikes in the shadow of Russia's threats against Europe and Ukraine. Belgium is hosting the annual drills which started on Monday the 17th of October over Britain and the North Sea. US B-52 bombers will swoop across the Atlantic in nuclear readiness drills. NATO refused to reschedule the annual operation, insisting it would send the wrong signal to Putin. We spoke to defence analyst and military commentator Stuart Crawford about the purpose of Steadfast Noon and what NATO aims to achieve with its drills.
Steadfast Noon is a recurring NATO exercise that happens annually, in which NATO exercises its nuclear response mechanisms. It is NATO-led, but of course the primary player in all of this is the USA. And basic format of it is what they call nuclear sharing, whereby the United States fits out aircraft of non-nuclear owning members of NATO, like Belgium and Italy, and then trains the pilots in how these systems, the targeting systems, operate and how to deliver a nuclear response. So there are 16 countries involved this time, I think, involving over 40 aircraft, some of which are involved in the actual nuclear response, and others which are involved in a sort of concurrent conventional exercise, which I think is called Exercise Snowcat. And the exercise this year is based in Belgium, which owns some of the dual capable, i.e. conventional and nuclear capable aircraft in the form of its F-16 fighter fleet. I think that the NATO release is quite clear that this has been a long-planned exercise, and they state quite clear that it's not linked to current events, by which they mean the conflict in Ukraine. And it's also been slated to last between the 17th of October and the 30th of October. So I don't see any shift in emphasis there. However, it would be quite understandable if cognizance was taken of the current conflict, war in Ukraine, and the fact that Vladimir Putin has been nuclear saber rattling for some time now and threatening to up the ante, which personally I think is a hollow threat and a sign of weakness. But nonetheless, I think people have to be careful and not dismiss that sort of scenario out of hand. The key point is that it really is not directly connected to the war in Ukraine. It's a routine annual exercise, which has happened many times before, and I dare say will happen many times again. And exercising a whole nuclear and conventional response to the threat of a nuclear attack. And that involves a whole gamut from planning to flight training, to operating with tanker aircraft, to using other aircraft equipped to suppress enemy air defenses, and so on and so forth. But it is pretty routine, although obviously in the back of the minds of the planners will be the fact that we have this conflagration in Eastern Europe and saber rattling by the Russians about the use of nuclear weapons. So I don't think there's anything to panic about. I think it's quite reassuring that NATO is doing this, and we should, I think, relax and just see what the outcome might be. The Russians are forever testing NATO member response times by flying aircraft close to but not within national airspaces. And the recent incursion by the Tupolev bombers near Alaska has flown them into the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone, but crucially not into US airspace. And this happens all the time. It's happening in Alaska. It happens in the North Sea frequently, and it's a demonstration of the fact that Russia can fly such missions, and also a test for NATO members generally, but other nations as well, as to their response. Now, in the UK, we always respond to such flights coming down from Norway down across the North Sea and into the North Atlantic for two reasons. First of all, to show the Russians that we know what they're doing and we're on it. and that they can't do it with impunity. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly in peacetime, when the Russians fly such flights, they turn the transponders off in their aircraft, and therefore civilian air control doesn't know where they are. Now, obviously, they're picked up in military radars, and a big part of the reason that we intercept is that when the, in Britain's case, the Typhoon aircraft intercept the Russians, we at least can plot where the Typhoons are, and therefore know where the Russians are, and warn civilian aircraft accordingly to stay clear. The B-52 bombers have been, they're 70 years old now, and they've gone through various iterations and modifications, and I think we're now looking at the B-52H model, which can, I mean, it carries an enormous payload of 70,000 pounds of bombs at full load, and it's capable of carrying a wide array of both conventional and nuclear-armed missiles, air missiles, cruise missiles, guided bombs, dumb bombs as they call them, unguided, and so on and so forth. I think the US's nuclear weapon of choice, particularly if we're talking about tactical rather than strategic response, is the B-61 bomb, which has got what they call a sort of dial-up capacity, which ranges probably between 0.3 of a kiloton up to 340 kilotons. So it transcends from a tactical nuclear weapon to a strategic nuclear weapon. And to put that in context, the Hiroshima bomb was 21 kilotons as opposed to 340 kilotons. So we're talking about a fairly impressive weapon. And that is their weapon of choice, a primary weapon of nuclear retaliation at the tactical to strategic level at the moment. But of course, there's a vast array of other weapon systems from cruise missiles upwards, which are nuclear capable as well. We need to remember that the only time that nuclear weapons have been used in war is when one side had them and one side didn't. And the US attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 were done against that background. And since multiple nations have had nuclear weapons, there's been no use of them, as far as I'm aware, although there's been obviously been testing in various scenarios. So the whole basis of deterrence is by owning nuclear weapons, other nuclear weapon states dare not utilize their weaponry for fear of massive retaliation. It used to be called mutual assured destruction in the days of the Cold War, and that's a sort of similar idea that continues to this day. In terms of Vladimir Putin's nuclear rhetoric, there's been a lot of scaremongering, in my opinion, about the potential use of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war. I think the chances of that happening are very, very small indeed. And for a number of reasons, but the main one is that it's been made quite clear to the Russians, both privately and publicly, by the USA and other NATO allies, that should the Russians escalate the war in Ukraine by the use of nuclear weapons, or indeed with chemical or biological weapons, then the response will be absolutely devastating. And in that sort of direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, there's only going to be one winner, and it isn't Russia. I really think there's been a lot of irresponsible scaremongering about nuclear weapons in Ukraine by people who should know better, like Tobias Ellwood, who's an ex-military officer and chair of the Defence Select Committee. He's been in the media time and time again, sort of doing the doom and gloom thing. In fact, he's on record as saying that he thinks that we will see nuclear weapons used within the next 10 years. Well, you know, he's hostage to fortune now, because that's now measurable. And I think he's completely and utterly wrong. I never dismissed the threat, but I don't think the chances are